The rain pounded against the window like 1,000 fists, the kind of rain that drags every drop down the glass, each one a tear of its own. Inside, the world was a blur of flashing lights and chaos, but in the corner of a room, a little girl crouched with her face buried in her trembling hands. Her sobs were heavy, desperate, a guttural cry that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. "Please help, they're killing my dog," she whispered through broken breaths, her voice barely above a murmur. Outside, the sirens screamed, but they weren't enough to drown out the sound of her broken heart. She had called 911 in a panic, her words barely comprehensible, but the pain was clear in every syllable. A police officer, his face unreadable, pulled the car to a stop in front of the house. The rain had soaked through his uniform, but he didn't care about the water. His eyes were locked on the girl's mother, standing in the doorway, crying too, her hands shaking as she looked down at the little girl's face. In the distance, through the pouring rain, the sound of barking, frantic, pleading, filled the air. But it wasn't the dog's bark that broke the officer. It was the sound of a child's heart breaking. The kind of sound that cuts through the storm, through all the noise, and echoes straight into the chest. What he would do next, in those next few seconds, would change everything. But would it be enough to save them? Show your love. Hit like, share, and subscribe for more. The storm had arrived without warning. It didn't just pour from the sky, it crashed down in sheets, battering the windows with the kind of ferocity that spoke of nature's fury. Inside, the house was eerily silent, save for the occasional thunderclap that rattled the windows. Emily sat on the edge of the couch, her small body curled into a tight ball, clutching her phone with trembling hands. The screen had been smeared with the remnants of her tears, and she wiped it with the back of her sleeve as if trying to erase the horror she had just witnessed. Max, her golden retriever, was more than just a pet. He was her protector, her constant companion, and her best friend. She couldn't remember a time when Max hadn't been by her side, when he hadn't curled up beside her at night, when he hadn't been there to nudge her hand in the middle of a tough day, when his tail wagged, chasing away the loneliness she sometimes felt. He had always been her one safe place. But tonight everything had changed. The quiet, peaceful home that had once been full of warmth had turned into a place of terror, and the dog that had once comforted her was now in the throes of something unimaginable. Emily's eyes were wide, bloodshot, her tear-streaked face a portrait of sheer panic. The words she had shouted earlier were still ringing in her ears, echoing in the hollow silence of the room. "Please help, they're killing my dog." She had never been one to scream, to shout for help. But tonight, fear had turned her voice into something raw, something jagged, something desperate. She had called 911 in a blind panic, her words coming out in fits and starts, half-choked sobs blending with every plea for someone, anyone, to help her. The dog, the only family she had left after her father had walked out, was in danger, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Her heart pounded in her chest as she paced in tight circles around the living room, her bare feet slapping against the wooden floor. The rain hammered down, its rhythmic pounding a constant reminder of the chaos outside. Inside, the house had never felt so cold, so lifeless. The warmth of Max's presence was gone, replaced by the thudding beat of Emily's panic-stricken heart. Then, just as she thought she might break under the weight of it all, the phone vibrated in her hand. It was the officer, Sergeant Davis. His voice, when it came through the phone, was calm, measured, but there was something in the way he said, "Stay on the line, Emily. I'm on my way," that made the tears spill again, this time in relief. She hadn't realized how much she had needed to hear those words until that moment. She wasn't alone. There was someone coming who could make it stop. But even as she held the phone to her ear, her gaze drifted to the front window, where the faint glow of headlights broke through the torrential downpour. The sirens cut through the air, piercing the night like a jagged knife. Sergeant Davis was almost here. She could barely breathe, her chest tight with fear. She wanted to run to the door, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. What if it was too late? What if she couldn't save Max? She knew that the officer was trained to handle situations like this, that he had been through countless dangerous situations. But this wasn't just any situation. This wasn't a case of an intruder or a typical assault. This was Max, the one creature who had never judged her, who had always been there when she was afraid or lonely, the one creature whose love was unconditional. If she lost him, she didn't know if she could ever recover. A faint bark echoed from somewhere deep inside the house. The sound of distress. The sound that had sent her scrambling for the phone in the first place. The bark was sharp and terrified, a cry for help that Emily couldn't ignore. She clutched the phone tighter, her fingers cold against the plastic, and whispered, "Please, please hurry." Through the pouring rain, the sound of boots hitting the pavement reached her ears, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone pounding on the front door. Emily rushed toward it, her breath coming faster now, her legs unsteady with the weight of everything that had happened in the past few minutes. She swung the door open, her eyes searching frantically for the officer, and there he was, Sergeant Davis, standing in the doorway, his uniform drenched from the storm but his eyes steely and determined. His face was stern, but there was a hint of empathy that softened his features as he looked down at her. "I'm here, Emily," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Tell me where he is." She nodded, swallowing hard, her throat tight as she pointed down the hallway. "In the living room. Please hurry, please." Her words faltered, and for a moment, she felt like she couldn't breathe. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She wasn't supposed to be standing here like this, not knowing what had happened to Max, not knowing if he was even alive. Sergeant Davis didn't waste a second. He moved swiftly down the hall, his boots silent on the hardwood floor as he pushed open the door to the living room. Emily hesitated for a moment, then followed him in, her heart hammering in her chest. Max was there, still alive, but barely. His body was trembling, his fur matted and soaked, but his eyes were wide with fear as they locked onto Emily's. He tried to lift his head but collapsed back to the floor, his body too weak to hold itself up. The man who had been hurting him was standing in the corner, his back hunched, his hands clenched into fists, his face red with rage. Sergeant Davis didn't hesitate. He stepped in front of Max, his eyes narrowing on the man. "Let the dog go," he ordered, his voice low and commanding. The man sneered, refusing to release his grip. "It's just a dog," he spat. "This thing doesn't matter." But to Emily, Max mattered more than anything. Max was family. In that moment, she realized something. She didn't care about the man's anger. She didn't care about the storm outside or the chaos that had consumed their lives. All she cared about was Max. "I won't let you hurt him anymore," Emily said, her voice trembling but fierce. Sergeant Davis moved swiftly, his hand on his belt, ready to protect them both. And with one last look at Emily, he moved forward, his presence a silent promise of safety. The man finally released Max, his anger deflating as he slumped back in defeat. Max, shaking and weak, limped toward Emily, his eyes locking onto hers, a silent promise that everything would be okay. And in that moment, she knew they had both been saved. The storm outside raged on, but in the heart of their home, the storm was finally over. The air inside the house felt thick, heavy with the weight of what had just happened. The rain continued its relentless pounding against the windows, a constant reminder of the storm outside, but inside, the room was still, almost eerily quiet. Sergeant Davis stood by the door, his back to the chaos of the living room as he surveyed the scene. Emily, her breath still ragged from the adrenaline, was kneeling on the floor, her hands gently stroking Max's fur. The dog, though weak, nuzzled into her, grateful for her touch, his body trembling but slowly finding comfort in the security of her arms. The man who had hurt Max sat in the far corner, his back pressed against the wall, his hands twitching as though they were still trying to hold on to something he'd lost control of. His face was red, his eyes wild with frustration. But there was a certain emptiness there now, as if the battle had drained him of everything. The officer stood motionless, his gaze locked on the man, reading him like a book, his every action calculated. But it was Emily, clutching Max close, who truly held his attention. She had been through something tonight that no child should ever have to endure. She had seen the darker side of the world, the side where people hurt the ones they loved, and in the process they destroy something far more valuable: trust. The officer's voice broke the silence, calm but firm. "What happened here?" he asked, not looking at the man, but instead speaking directly to Emily's mother, who had remained standing in the doorway, her eyes filled with a mix of guilt and disbelief. Emily's mother took a long, shaky breath, her fingers still gripping the edge of the doorframe, as if it were the only thing keeping her from falling apart. I don't know what to say," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never thought he would go this far." Emily's mother was clearly in shock, her eyes unfocused, her thoughts fragmented. The officer's gaze softened, but only for a moment. He couldn't afford to let his guard down now. The situation, while diffused for the moment, was far from over. He moved slowly, deliberately, crossing the room to where the man sat. The man didn't make a move to stop him. His face was pale now, the anger having drained from his features, replaced by a hollow emptiness that made Sergeant Davis's stomach turn. This wasn't just about Max. This was about something deeper, something broken inside this man. "You need to tell me what happened," the officer repeated, his voice unwavering. The man shifted uncomfortably, but refused to meet the officer's gaze. "It's just a dog," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "She's been too soft on him." The officer's eyes narrowed. "That dog is her family," he said, his voice growing colder. "You don't hurt family. Do you understand that?" The man's lips trembled as he stared at the floor. He nodded, but the officer could see the tension in his body, the way he fought against his own regret, his own self-loathing. It was as though he had no idea how he had gotten here, how it had escalated to this point. Emily's mother finally spoke again, her voice strained and apologetic. "He was supposed to be helping with the repairs," she said, glancing toward the man, then back to the officer. But he started drinking, and everything just went wrong. I couldn't stop him. I tried to call for help, but..." Her voice broke, and she shook her head in disbelief. "I'm so sorry. I never thought he'd hurt Max. Not like this." Sergeant Davis looked from Emily's mother to the man who had once been a part of their lives, someone they had trusted. He could see the brokenness in Emily's mother's eyes. She wasn't making excuses. She was just lost. She had allowed herself to believe the lies, to trust a man who was unraveling at the seams, a man who had begun to unravel everything in his path, including the trust that was so fragile between them all. The officer took a deep breath, absorbing the situation. It wasn't just the act of violence that disturbed him. It was the realization that, for some, this was the only kind of love they knew. It wasn't the kind of love that healed or nurtured. It was destructive, possessive, tainted by everything this man had failed to overcome. He could see that now. Turning back toward Emily, the officer noticed her eyes had never left the man. She was staring at him with an intensity that made him pause. Her small frame was stiff, her jaw clenched, her fingers still stroking Max's fur, but there was something else in her gaze. Something deeper. "I don't want him here anymore," Emily said suddenly, her voice quiet but unwavering. It wasn't a scream, but a declaration. It was the kind of statement that carried a weight far beyond her years. The officer met her gaze, nodding. "You're right," he said gently, his voice full of quiet understanding. "You don't have to be afraid anymore. He won't hurt you or Max again." The man, still seated in the corner, looked up for the first time, his face pale, almost pleading. I didn't mean to." His voice cracked, as if trying to justify himself in the face of everything he had done. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Emily didn't flinch. She didn't say another word. She didn't need to. Her strength had already spoken louder than any words could. Sergeant Davis stepped forward, his hand firmly resting on the man's shoulder as he gently pushed him away from the corner, guiding him toward the door. "You need to leave," the officer said firmly. "Now." The man didn't resist. He stood up, his movements slow and unsteady, like someone who had come to terms with the fact that their world had just crumbled. He walked out of the house without another word, disappearing into the rain-soaked night. Once the door closed behind him, the house seemed to exhale, a silent breath of relief passing through the walls. Sergeant Davis stood in the doorway, his eyes taking in the scene before him. Emily was still sitting on the floor, her body pressed close to Max, her small arms wrapped tightly around him, as though she was trying to shield him from the storm outside, from the storm that had just raged inside. The officer's chest tightened as he watched them. He couldn't help but wonder how long it would take for Emily to feel safe again, for Max to trust once more, for the shattered pieces of this family to be put back together. There was no magic fix for trauma, no quick and easy cure for the pain they had endured. But in that moment, Sergeant Davis knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something new, something better. Emily and Max had survived the storm, and they would survive this too. He just hoped they could find their way back to trust again, to each other. The morning after the storm felt like a dream. The sky was gray, the rain had stopped, but everything still felt wet, heavy as though the earth itself was still recovering from the chaos. Inside the house, it was quieter now, but the silence was the kind that clung to the air, suffocating and thick. Emily sat at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug as she stared out the window. Max, her loyal companion, lay curled up at her feet, but his eyes were filled with a wariness that mirrored her own. It had been a long night. After Sergeant Davis left, things had settled, but not in the way Emily had hoped. She couldn't shake the image of the man's face. The anger, the brokenness, the guilt. She didn't know how to process it, how to fit it into the puzzle of her life. Her mind replayed the events of the night over and over, each moment sharper, more intense than the last. But it wasn't the man's anger or the chaos that haunted her. It was the feeling of helplessness, the gnawing realization that everything had changed in the blink of an eye. Her trust, her sense of safety, had been shattered. And with it, she feared, a part of her childhood had been lost too. Max lifted his head and let out a low whine, his body trembling slightly. Emily looked down at him, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. His eyes were searching her face, as though asking the same question she had been asking herself all night. What now? Before she could answer him, the sound of the doorbell echoed through the house, breaking the heavy silence. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone. She glanced down at Max, who had risen to his feet, his tail stiff. She stood up slowly, her feet dragging on the floor as she walked to the door, her mind racing. When she opened it, she wasn't prepared for the sight that met her. Sergeant Davis was standing on the doorstep once again, his face softer than the night before, but still marked with the weight of everything that had happened. He was no longer in his uniform, but the quiet authority in his demeanor still hung in the air. He wasn't just the officer who had intervened last night. He was something else now, a reminder of the fragile thread that held them all together. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice gentle. But there was an underlying concern that made Emily hesitate. She nodded, stepping aside to let him enter, though she couldn't quite bring herself to smile. Max, who had been cautiously sniffing the air, barked once, his tail wagging slowly. The officer crouched down, offering a quiet greeting, but his eyes were drawn to Emily. "How are you holding up?" he asked, standing back up as he surveyed the room. Emily bit her lip, unsure how to answer. How was she holding up? She wasn't sure if she even knew. The truth was, she wasn't okay. Not yet. The night had broken something inside her, something deep and unspoken, and she wasn't sure how to put it back together. "I'm trying," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's just everything feels different now." Sergeant Davis nodded, as though he understood. He stepped farther into the room, glancing around, his eyes softening as they landed on Max, who had returned to his spot on the floor. "It's never easy, especially when the danger comes from someone you trust," he said quietly, sitting down at the table across from her. "But you're doing the right thing, Emily. You're safe now, and Max is safe." Max raised his head at the mention of his name, his tail thumping softly against the floor as he padded over to Emily, resting his head on her knee. Emily absent-mindedly stroked his fur, her fingers trembling slightly. "I don't know if I believe that," she confessed, her voice thick with emotion. "How can I ever feel safe again? How do I trust people after what happened?" Her words hung in the air, the vulnerability in them heavier than the rain outside. What if this happens again? What if someone else comes in and hurts us? Sergeant Davis studied her for a long moment, his gaze thoughtful. The weight of her words hit him harder than he expected. He had seen fear before, the kind that comes in an instant and disappears just as quickly. But the fear Emily spoke of was different. It was the kind of fear that stays with you, gnawing at the edges of your every thought. It was the kind of fear that makes you question everything you thought you knew. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Trust takes time, Emily," he said gently. "You can't just turn it on and off. But you don't have to trust anyone right now. Not until you're ready. What matters is that you take it one step at a time. You don't have to have all the answers today. It's okay to feel like you don't know what's next." Emily let out a shaky breath, her shoulders sagging as she listened. It wasn't a magical fix, but it was the kind of answer that made her feel a little less alone in the storm. It wasn't easy to admit it, but maybe she didn't have to have it all figured out right now. Maybe healing was a process, something that couldn't be rushed, something that would take as long as it needed. "And what about Max?" she asked, her voice thick with concern. "I know he's scared. He keeps looking at me like he's waiting for the next thing to happen. How do I make him feel safe again?" Sergeant Davis smiled softly, understanding. "Max is strong. He's been through a lot, but the best thing you can do for him right now is exactly what you're doing. Be there. Be calm. Let him know that you're safe. Dogs are incredibly intuitive. They feel what we feel. If he sees you healing, he'll begin to heal too." Emily looked down at Max, whose brown eyes were staring up at her with the kind of trust that made her heart ache. She could almost see the flickers of fear still lingering in his gaze. But there was something else there too, something that mirrored her own resolve. Maybe they were both broken, but they were still here, still together. "What happens now?" Emily asked quietly, her voice barely audible, as though she was afraid to speak the words aloud. Sergeant Davis stood up, his face serious, but not unkind. "Now we take things day by day. You've already taken the hardest step by standing up for yourself, standing up for Max. The rest will come when you're ready. And when it does, you'll be stronger than you were before." He paused, his eyes softening as he met her gaze. "You're not alone in this. Not now, not ever." As he turned to leave, Emily watched him go, the weight of his words settling deep in her chest. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't know what the future held. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was fighting this battle alone. The days following Sergeant Davis's visit felt like a blur. Time passed slowly, each minute stretching into the next, a constant reminder that the world around her was moving forward, even if Emily felt stuck in place. The mornings were the hardest. She would wake to the soft sound of raindrops tapping against her window, the heavy weight of the silence wrapping around her, like a thick blanket. Max would be there beside her, his body curled up tightly in the same spot, as if he, too, was trying to avoid the reality of what had happened. The warmth he offered was a comfort, but it wasn't enough to stop the memories from clawing their way to the surface. It wasn't just the terror of the night that haunted her. It wasn't just the sounds of Max's desperate barks, or the sickening sight of the man's rage. What hurt the most, what really cut deep, was the quiet. The feeling of loss that had settled into every corner of the house, like dust gathering on forgotten shelves. Things would never be the same again. Emily didn't know if she could ever trust this place, this home, the way she once had. It had been torn apart in an instant. Max, too, was struggling. His once joyful barks had turned to fearful whimpers. His eyes, which had once glowed with excitement every time Emily walked into the room, now flickered with uncertainty. He followed her everywhere, never more than a few feet away, his tail tucked low, his head always tilted as though waiting for something bad to happen. Every creak of the floorboards, every sound from outside, sent him into a state of anxious alertness. Emily could see it. The way he flinched whenever the door opened, the way his ears flattened when someone raised their voice. He wasn't just physically wounded. The trauma was inside him, buried deep within his heart. But Emily, in her own way, was trying to heal too. Each day, she forced herself to get out of bed, to move through the motions, even though every part of her wanted to crawl back into the safety of the blankets and pretend the world hadn't changed. The world had changed, though it was impossible to ignore. But what she had learned in the days after Sergeant Davis left was that sometimes healing wasn't about finding a way to erase the pain. Sometimes healing was simply about learning to live with it. Emily was trying, but it wasn't easy. The grief weighed on her like a stone, and each time she thought she might have it under control, it would resurface. In the quiet of the morning, in the hollow silence of the house, or in the way Max's eyes would search hers, looking for the protection she couldn't always offer. The house, once filled with the sounds of laughter and the smell of her mother's cooking, was now filled with echoes. Silent, unsettling echoes that seemed to fill every room. The empty spaces felt bigger, more isolating. There was an emptiness that couldn't be filled, a hole where the warmth of trust and safety had once been. Max, though he was struggling, still tried to comfort her in the only way he knew how. He would nudge her hand with his nose, lick her cheek when her tears spilled, as though he was silently telling her that he was still there, that they were still together. And when she would kneel down beside him, her hands cradling his head, she could feel the love between them, raw and unspoken, but so powerful that it made her heart ache. One afternoon, after a particularly heavy rainstorm, Emily sat in the living room, staring at the empty space where the man had been only days before. Her fingers gently ran through the pages of a book, but she wasn't really reading. She had opened the book as a distraction, as something to anchor her in the present. But it wasn't enough. Nothing felt like enough. Max, sensing her restlessness, padded over to her side and lay down next to her, his head resting against her leg. The silence stretched between them until Emily's mother walked into the room, her expression drawn, her eyes heavy with the same sorrow that seemed to have taken over the house. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at Emily and Max, before she spoke. "Emily," her mother began, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to make it right." Emily didn't look up, didn't speak. She knew her mother was trying, but the words didn't come easy for her either. They both carried the weight of what had happened, though it was different for each of them. Her mother had trusted someone who had betrayed them both, and Emily had lost the one thing she had always relied on: safety. Her mother stepped into the room and sat next to Emily, her presence warm but distant. "I wish I could take it all back," she whispered. "I wish I could make you feel safe again." Emily finally looked up, her eyes meeting her mother's, and for the first time in days, she spoke. "I know you didn't mean for it to happen," she said softly. "But it did, and I don't know how to make it better." Her voice faltered, the weight of her own words hitting her with the full force of their meaning. Her mother reached out, placing her hand on Emily's. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said, her voice breaking. "We'll make it through this. I swear." Emily's heart ached at the sincerity in her mother's voice, but the truth lingered in the air, unspoken and sharp. Some wounds run too deep to heal quickly. Time, they both knew, would be the only thing that could mend the brokenness. Just then, there was a sound from the hallway, the creak of a door opening. Both Emily and her mother turned to see Max, his ears perked up, his body tense as he stood in the doorway, looking at them with those eyes that had once been so full of trust. Now they were filled with uncertainty, as though waiting for the next moment of chaos, the next wave of pain to come crashing through the door. But instead of running away, as he once might have done, Max took a few hesitant steps forward, his body trembling as he moved closer to Emily. She reached down, her hand trembling as she stroked his fur. Max leaned into her touch, his body relaxing just slightly. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't a fix. But it was enough for that moment. It was a reminder that even in the darkest times, even when everything felt lost, there were still small glimmers of light. Her mother watched them, a tear slipping down her cheek. Emily, for the first time in days, allowed herself to lean into the comfort of Max's presence, feeling the weight of her grief lighten, just for a moment. It wasn't gone, not by a long shot, but with Max by her side, and with her mother's quiet promise of love, she knew she could begin to rebuild. Max wasn't just a dog. He was a reminder of what mattered, what she had lost, but also what she could still hold on to. The days blurred together, but something shifted in the house as the weeks passed. Emily began to feel the weight of grief slowly lifting, not with grand gestures, but with small, quiet moments. She would wake each morning to the soft rustle of Max's tail against the bed, his warmth beside her, a reminder that they had both survived the storm. The house, still marked by the echoes of the past, had started to feel like home again. Max had begun to regain some of his old spark. His tail wagged once more, though sometimes cautiously, as if testing the waters of trust again. Emily's heart lifted each time she saw it. She had started taking him on walks again, step by step, each outing a small victory. It wasn't perfect. There were moments when the weight of what had happened pressed down on her, but they had learned to live with it, to move forward together. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily stood by the window, Max beside her. She smiled, her heart light, knowing that, though the past would always be a part of them, they had a future, one they would rebuild together. And for the first time in a long while, Emily felt a quiet peace settle over her. The storm had passed.